So the other perspective we're going to get now is from Lewis Willumsen, who's going to give a more European, maybe South American perspective. Thank you.
This year started well in January, and I thought that I understood the world, the Western world, reasonably well, and that the year was going to pan out in a way that was predictable. You all know how wrong I was. I do not feel that I understand the world anymore as I did a year ago. And the only thing I can tell you guys is that we are in trouble. The future is going to be even more different than the present. And this is going to create problems for all of us. The future is uncertain, has always been uncertain. But the future is now even more uncertain than before. And we don't have yet the tools to deal with it. We have political uncertainties, and these are very, very significant in two ways. One, because they affect, for example, how fast London will grow, but also because it reflects the fact that we don't really fully understand what people want. And this is worrying if our models have to respond to what people want. We have behavioral changes, which are important. Peak car is one of them, which has been mentioned many times. The use of social networks and how they interact with actually face-to-face interactions is important. We have talked extensively about connected and autonomous vehicles today, and we will continue talking about them. Artificial intelligence and machine learning will change the way things are done in the future as well, including modeling. The work field is changing. I'm now a freelance operator. The way I travel for work is practically unpredictable by any model. Sometimes I stay at home, sometimes I don't go to work to meetings and so on. And there's more people like me all the time, not just in our field. Shopping and leisure has changed with the internet. Amazon is one big example. Energy sources are important, and in particular, energy prices. And we know that in the last couple of years, the price of oil has gone up and down like a yo-yo. Additive manufacturing, 3D printing is something that is changing the way in which we do things, we manufacture things, where we do them, closer to the place in which they're going to be used. And finally, hopefully, and today's statement by Donald Trump was helpful, perhaps there is something about human activity that may influence climate change. That's as far as he went. So these things happen, and we want to provide advice to decision makers, policy makers. And we hope that this advice can be supported by models. We are going into uncharted territory, and we need some kind of ideas of how to envision the future, and what can we do now in order to prepare for that. New data sources will help, and these have been mentioned several times, and I have a vested interest in a couple of them as well in my other hat. But the digital traces that we leave with all the activities that we perform, as somebody suggested just now, Google quite knows that we're all here today, now. Probably know what we're talking about as well. But we need to understand how we're going to change our models. And in that sense, the previous presentation was quite interesting. It resonates with a couple of ideas that I'm going to present as well. Sadly, I'm not giving you a overarching European or Latin American perspective in this. I'm just giving you some of my own ideas, which have evolved over time, on how to deal with this more uncertain future. I think the first item is we should ask the right question. And there are several ways of asking the right question, but today asking the right question requires conversation with other people, other stakeholders. We cannot ask the right question just policymakers or modelers. Secondly, we have to recognize the difficulties that we face in trying to answer that critical question. Third, we have to accept limitations. And one of them, which we have repeated very often here, is that the future is quite unpredictable and more unpredictable now than it used to be. Finally, or not finally, fourth, identify what matters most. This has a couple of dimensions which we're going to mention in next. Then adopt an approach, ideally a better one to deal with the problems we're facing. And finally, not forgetting, we should test the approach and improve it. And this is a constant process. So we look first to ask the right question. For example, what is the best model to forecast transport impacts in the future society? More or less the question of this meeting. I pose to you that this is not actually the right question. Neither is this one. What is the most accurate transport model to forecast the future? Those two questions are non-questions, really don't lead you anywhere in a world that is uncertain. A much better question is, how do we provide advice? How do we help decision makers to make better decisions? And that doesn't necessarily mean chasing an impossible accuracy in our models. The four difficulties that we face, these are technical difficulties. We all know about them, and certainly we know about several of them since the 2007-2008 crisis. All our models are based essentially on Homo economicus, and we know that this guy doesn't exist. It's very convenient for the maths, but actually is not a human being. Human beings are collaborative, have emotions, forget things, and so on. So our models are very rough approximation of human beings, a very idealized approximation of human beings. We then assume that the parameters we usually calibrate for the base year are going to remain for the future. Values of time, trip generation rates, and so on. We know now that this is not true either, that we change our mind, that we travel sometimes less, sometimes more, that the principles, the ideas that we value most today are not going to be the same as we will value in the future. We also apply in all our models what I call an activity, regularity, or recurrence assumption. We observe data on a couple of occasions, a household survey, and then assume that people do exactly the same thing in the future. And they do exactly the same thing not only in the future, but in the present, day after day. They go to work every day, they go shopping every 2 or 3 days, and so on. And we know now that this is wrong. People don't do the same things day after day, but it's a necessary assumption in our models. And finally, the most interesting one is the context. And we know that the context, in particular with autonomous vehicles and Donald Trump and artificial intelligence, is also changing very fast and is no longer a repetition of what it was in the past. Now, in dealing with this, I have used this diagram a couple of times already, so some of you may be familiar with it. The idea that it's very difficult to have an accurate estimate of the future. It's impossible to have an accurate estimate of the future impact. The future is uncertainty. We have uncertainty coming from our models. We have uncertainty coming from the base year data that we use to calibrate our models. We have even more uncertainty when we have to use data about the future, because that's even less accurate than it is the data about the present. And finally, we have black swans, so scenario changes, and autonomous vehicles is one of them. And if I'm right in saying that we are living in a more uncertain world, or we will be living in a more uncertain world in the future, this uncertainty increases all the time, and it will never be very accurate. The consequence of that is that we cannot pretend that we can forecast the future as such. We can only forecast a range of futures, and this is the third time this is mentioned here in this presentation. So what do we do when we have a range of futures? What do we try to achieve then? We can try to identify policies that will survive all these futures, and this has already been suggested as a key element in the USA. Or you can look for policies that will work reasonably well in several futures, and if necessary can be adapted, can be changed, can be respond to a future which actually was not foreseen at all. And this is typically pricing policies are of that nature. They're very flexible to change them. We can also look for projects that work well, survive all the futures. And we had in the past a table of 4 boxes where we can fit projects, whether they survive or not in different futures, or they can be adapted to different futures. And the use of the framework of real options, as opposed to financial options, is a useful way of thinking about this, and I think is going to have more relevance in the future. But in particular, we're looking for plans and policies that are flexible, that we can change and we can adapt them, because we don't really are able to forecast the future as such. The sad bit of the story is that we are not thinking in this way today. We are still, most of the time, producing single point forecasts, single numbers. This is what's going to happen. And it's also sad that most decision makers are also asking for the single point numbers, rather than for this range of possible futures. So we need to select an approach. And in the model, in the short term, I think we should use our current modeling tools a little bit better, and I have a couple of suggestions for that. We should improve and have better modeling tools in the medium term, and we need to do some research in order to get there. New data sources will help significantly, and probably the most attractive contribution to me is the fact that we can now discover what happened when there was an interruption in service or a flooding. This is very popular here, but I was last week in New Zealand, and it was an earthquake that modifies the road network, and discovering how people moved on that occasion without having to instrument anything, thanks to cell data, for example, is very helpful, because we take advantage of spontaneous experiments, something that we have not been able to do in transport for a very, very long time. Some of the things that we're going to use are not necessarily modeling tools, but decision-making tools. I think we need to explore a range of alternative decision-making tools to help us get there. Better use of existing tools, embrace uncertainty, is there, we cannot avoid it. Allow adjustments because of the imperfections of the modeling. For example, we know that the gravity model assumes that as soon as we introduce Crossrail, everybody will move home and change jobs to account for this new accessibility. This is not true. There will be lags in behavior. There will be some advanced behavior, and there will be lags in behavior. So accounting for that is not that difficult. It's something that we can introduce also in our models. Given the political turmoil of 2016, I think it's very important that in our models we identify winners and losers. And we also identify big wins and small wins, or small losses. We need to understand better how the projects affect different sectors of the community, in not just global cost-benefit analysis. And finally, we must accept that there are a number of subjective and judgmental elements in our models. I mean, their models are not today scientific tools as such. They are helps to decision-making. Pointers for improving models, and I can only offer you pointers, and probably the last one is the most important one. We can do research on the 4 big difficulties I mentioned before. The fact that Homo sapiens is different from Homo economicus. This is a very difficult one. There's been some attempt in behavioral economics to deal with this issue, but actually the success is very partial. I mean, prospect theory is one of these approaches, but it's very far from actually accounting for human beings as they really are, not as we imagine them to provide good, simple mathematics. The activity regularity assumption. Here I see a little bit more hope. The fact that we have a lot of new data, big data, traces of all the movement, smart cards, Oyster cards, and so on, enable us to understand much better the variability from day to day, which at the moment we were very limited in our understanding. How things change with the weather, for example, winter and summer, and so on. So we are going to make progress there, I hope, with greater understanding of how things change over time. The fixed parameters, the fact that our preferences seem to be cast in stone and we project them forever in the future. This is again a difficult area. We need to understand how is it that we change our mind. And obviously we do, but we don't really understand very well the motivation behind the mechanisms where these operate. And I think brain sciences are going to help us in that direction as well. And finally, the issue of spotted swans. Autonomous vehicles is a spotted swan. It's not a black swan. We know it's going to happen. We don't know what impact it's going to have, but we know it's going to happen. And there we can share knowledge, and we can appeal to the wisdom of crowds and understand better, sharing information between different people on what we expect these things to happen. We have to learn and to live and embrace uncertainty. We can use all the new tools for dealing with uncertainty in that sense. I have been using Delphi tools with some advantage. Drivers analysis, which is another way of dealing with what's going to happen with autonomous vehicles. Are we going to rent them? Are we going to hire them? Or are we going to own them? What proportion of people will do one or the other? Horizon scanning. There are several techniques of that nature, and not models. These are techniques for human interaction and gathering the knowledge of many people in order to reach useful conclusions. And certainly understand better how to represent the uncertainty in our forecasts. And there are several techniques for doing that. One is modeling deconstruction, in which you show the different components. In this case, an example there of a future demand for a light rail scheme, how much is transferred from other modes, and so on. You can do stochastic risk analysis, which is what the financial community loves to do, and which brought us the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. But there you are. Scenario planning, I think, is much more central to what we do, and has been mentioned a couple of times already. And that's going to happen, and I'm particularly keen on real options in the sense of looking at how much more expensive it is to build, say, a bridge so that it can cope with additional demand or a different nature of demand in the future, provide the cost of providing additional flexibility. Essentially, that's what real options is. Finally, and this is my last slide, another set of suggestions. We should do more experiments. I think the theory is a bit spent now. We should do much more experiments, and big data allow us to do these experiments or take advantage when they happen spontaneously. Because learning about how people change their mind is crucial to understanding or developing new type of models. We should also take advantage of what I call here precursors of what is coming. I mean, Uber is a precursor of mobility as a service. Sadly, they're not very generous with the data. But learning how Uber is used, for example, I suspect, because of my children, that younger people use Uber much more than older people. The familiarity with apps is necessary and confidence that nobody will pinch your credit card details in the Uber system is essential. But understanding better how that operates will give us better ideas on how we could model that in the future. Car clubs and car sharing activities, which have not been very successful so far compared to Uber, for example. But even looking at that microcosm and understanding better whether, for example, people who have relinquished their car and they now use zip cars, do they travel more or travel less by car, for example? What other modes of transport they use, what they use a car for, that sort of understanding. The gig economy, the fact that we're all temporary workers on zero-hour contracts, not all of you, but many. How does it affect our travel patterns? That's also an important. Regional differences are crucial, I think, not only in the USA, which is a very big country, but also in Europe and in Britain as well. The impacts and the intensive of internet procurement. Britain has the reputation, in fact, is objectively true, of being the heaviest user of internet shopping in the world, even more than USA. That is true, and obviously is changing the way in which deliveries are made, how many, and shopping trips are made. And finally, distance presence and virtual reality. They are becoming very good and very cheap, and they are going to be a substitute, a better substitute of traveling for meetings and so on. And we should look at that, both from a behavioral perspective, how people change in their behavior, and the operational perspective, how many more trips happen, and so on. So those are, I think, what I would call the pointers. I think there's going to be a change, I guess, in the way in which we communicate these new ideas and this type of research. Traditionally, academics and some consultants publish papers, and they take about a couple of years to get published. And usually they extol the virtues of the work done, and they tend to hide away the difficulties and sometimes the errors that are being committed. I think we should be much more transparent and share this limited information we're gathering about how the future will pan out, and share that information in a different context, in a wiki-like context, rather than just a set of publications and papers. I think there is a good case for sharing and monitoring these developments, understanding, for example, how Uber and autonomous vehicles are panning out in Pittsburgh, where they are operating at the moment. Now, what effects does it have? How people use it or not use it, and so on. And this should be incorporated almost in real time, at a very short notice, because the future is getting faster and faster. It's changing faster and faster. We cannot wait 2 years until the papers are published. We need really to understand and collate this information, arrange it in a way that is useful, but is necessary for our future modeling tasks. That's all. Thank you.